I'm going to give it to them.
One of the greatest movies ever made, only to discover that for almost 30 years, you weren't really watching the complete film at all. What if I told you that the version of Lawrence of Arabia that won 7 Academy Awards, that made critics cry with joy, that turned Peter O'Toole into a legend, was actually a chopped-up version of something much more powerful and disturbing? This is the incredible true story of how Hollywood's greed buried one of cinema's most important masterpieces, and how the real ending that director David Lean intended would change everything you think you know about Lawrence of Arabia. In December 1962, Queen Elizabeth herself sat in a London theater and watched a version of Lawrence of Arabia that lasted 3 hours and 42 minutes. Just 3 weeks later, that version disappeared forever. And for the next 27 years, millions of people around the world watched a completely different movie without knowing it. But here's the crazy part. The scenes that were cut weren't just random bits of dialogue or pretty desert shots. They revealed the true Lawrence, a man so brutal and terrifying that when test audiences saw him, they literally got up and walked out of the theater in horror. The real Lawrence wasn't the complicated hero you think you know. He was something much, much darker. Let me take you back to where this all began. It's 1960, and the Lawrence of Arabia project is falling apart before they even start filming. The first script was written by Michael Wilson, but when director David Lean read it in the middle of the Jordanian desert, he was so angry that he walked out completely. He left an entire film crew stranded in the sand and told everyone the script was impossible to film. Columbia Pictures was panicking. They had already spent a fortune, and now their director had quit. In desperation, producer Sam Spiegel called Robert Bolt, a playwright who had never written a movie script in his life. Bolt agreed to help, but he warned them he would have to start completely over from scratch. What happened next was like something out of a movie itself. Lean flew back to London, and he and Bolt worked around the clock. During the day, Bolt would write new pages. At night, he and Lean would sit together, drinking and talking about every single scene until sunrise. Then they would put those fresh pages on a plane and fly them across the desert to the waiting crew. The film crew started calling this crazy system Camel Mail. In just a few weeks, they had thrown out almost everything from the original script. When it was all over, less than 10% of Michael Wilson's original work had survived. What started as the script that wouldn't cross the sand became the foundation for one of the greatest films ever made. But even with a new script, the movie was still in serious trouble. Lawrence of Arabia cost $15 million to make, which was more than any British film had ever cost before. Columbia Pictures agreed to distribute the movie, but they made Sam Spiegel personally responsible for every penny that went over budget. Sam Spiegel sitting in a makeshift office in the middle of the Jordanian desert, with generator lights buzzing around him, signing payment slips late into the night. He hired over 1,000 local people as extras, 300 camels, and 150 horse handlers, and every single payment came out of his own pocket. The crew members started calling the whole thing Spiegel's folly, because they thought he was crazy to risk so much money. But Spiegel wasn't the only one taking risks. David Lean was coming off a terrible failure. After his success with The Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957, he had spent 2 years trying to make a film about Gandhi, but nothing worked out. Lean later said he was so discouraged that he was ready to quit making movies forever. Then Sam Spiegel called him with an idea that changed everything. He didn't just want to make a movie about Lawrence. He wanted to make a film where the desert itself was like a mirror showing what was inside Lawrence's mind. That concept excited Lean so much that he became obsessed with making the desert a character in the story. There's one famous shot in the movie where Omar Sharif appears in the distance, riding toward the camera through the shimmering heat. That single shot took 4 days to film, and they destroyed several cameras trying to get it right. But when Lean saw the final result, He knew he had captured something magical. That moment killed all his talk about retirement. Meanwhile, Columbia Pictures executives were getting nervous. They worried that Lean's slow, artistic approach wouldn't work for American audiences. So secretly, they hired 2 writers to create a completely different version of the script. This alternate version added a fictional American character, a love story, and a patriotic ending with American flags waving. 1961. Lean read it, called it Hollywood trash, and literally ripped it up in front of the entire crew. Robert Bolt later said he never wrote a single romantic scene, and he thanked Lean for keeping the desert story pure. The crew jokingly called the destroyed script Operation Sabotage. Casting the lead role was another nightmare. When Peter O'Toole's screen test reached Columbia executives in February 1961, they dismissed him as just a pretty face with no real talent. They wanted Cary Grant instead, even though Grant was 57 years old. David Lean exploded at this suggestion. He secretly ordered a second screen test where O'Toole shouted lines from Lawrence's book while firing a gun. When that version reached Hollywood overnight, the studio chief's response was immediate. "The kid terrifies me. He stays." O'Toole was hired for £15,000, which was only 1/12 of what Cary Grant had demanded. Before O'Toole, they had talked to Marlon Brando. In late 1960, Brando's agent asked for $1 million plus 10% of all the movie's profits. At the time, this was an unheard of amount. Brando had just become the first actor to earn $1 million for Mutiny on the Bounty, and now he wanted to double down. Spiegel refused, and Brando called him a Hollywood parasite. Brando then mailed a postcard from Tahiti that read, "Too hot in the desert, try Fiji." And that was the end of those talks. Once filming started, the drama continued. Anthony Quinn arrived in Jordan in July 1961 and discovered that his role as Auda Abu Tai had been cut dramatically to make more room for Omar Sharif's character. Quinn was furious and told Leon he would quit unless his big speech about his 23 wounds was put back in the movie. Leon compromised by letting Quinn keep his speech, while Sharif got the famous entrance scene across the Mirage. Their feud lasted for months, and crew members started calling their camel caravans the Quinn-ometer, because tempers flared every time a scene focused on someone other than Ada. Not everyone complained loudly, though. Alec Guinness, who played Prince Faisal, kept his worries to himself. Letters he wrote in 1962, which weren't published until decades later, revealed that he was deeply uncomfortable about wearing brown makeup to play an Arab character. He worried that the makeup would make him look like a ridiculous caricature. Still, he took the role for £100,000 and stayed quiet in public. In private, he begged Lean to light him softly, to make him look ghost-like rather than fake. His concerns about representation came years before such conversations reached mainstream Hollywood. Claude Rains had just 2 weeks to prepare for his role. On August 1, 1961, he was vacationing in New Hampshire when Robert Newton, the actor originally cast as Dryden, died of a heart attack. Rains was flown to Jordan immediately. He hadn't read Lawrence's book, didn't know the script, and had only small pieces of dialogue taped inside his head wrap. He learned most of his lines while bouncing through the desert in a jeep, reading pages that were taped to the dashboard. 4 hours after arriving, he was in costume and in front of the camera. Then came December 10, 1962. Something very strange happened in London that night. Queen L. Even the shortened version made a fortune. The movie earned nearly $70 million against its $15 million budget. By trimming it down, theaters could squeeze in 1 extra showing per day. That small change boosted revenue by about 20% in every cinema. Everyone thought they were watching the complete masterpiece, but what they saw had already been edited for profit. For 27 years, the original cut stayed hidden. People unknowingly paid to see a version that had lost important pieces, and the money kept pouring in. Critics loved the movie from the very start. They praised Maurice Jarre's music, The stunning dessert scenes captured by Freddie Young and Peter O'Toole's unforgettable performance. Their reviews helped turn the film into a legend. But here's the shocking truth. Every single one of those reviews was written about the shortened version. None of the critics knew that the film had already lost 9 pages of dialogue. They were writing about a version that David Lean later called crippled. The truth didn't come out until 1989, when the full version was finally restored. That's when film scholars realized that what people had been calling a masterpiece for decades was never the complete story. The Academy Awards didn't catch it either. On April 8, 1963, at the 35th Academy Awards, Lawrence of Arabia won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. But the Academy members had only seen the shortened version. Columbia's press materials listed 202 minutes as the official running time, so no one questioned it. When the full cut returned in 1989, historians finally understood a disturbing truth. The Academy had given its highest honor to a film that wasn't shown in its complete form. Lean never made a public scene about it, but when the longer version was finally restored, he approved it as. When Lean found out about the missing shot, he was absolutely furious. He had spent years working as a film editor before becoming a director, and he treated every single frame like a brick in a perfect building. When he learned that the goggles scene had been cut while he was still working on the movie's sound in December 1962, he sent a letter calling it artistic vandalism. He was so angry that he didn't speak to Sam Spiegel for almost a year. They communicated only through assistants, even during the Oscar campaign. But the missing beginning was nothing compared to what had been cut from the middle of the movie. In 1917, something happened to T. Lawrence in the Turkish town of Daraya that he would never fully recover from. According to his own words in his book 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he was stripped, beaten, and sexually assaulted by the Turkish governor. When the movie was made in 1962, the original script showed this scene just as brutally as Lawrence had described it. But in the final cut that audiences saw, most of it was removed. All that remained was some pushing, some hitting, and a long, uncomfortable stare. Even with the heavy editing, viewers could sense that something terrible had happened. But by not showing the full horror, the movie lost something vital. Lawrence's later brutality, especially during the massacre at the village of Tafas, ended up looking like a sudden personality change. The truth is, it wasn't sudden at all. It was the direct result of severe trauma. In the original version, Jose Ferrer's performance as the Turkish Bey was absolutely terrifying. During the Daraya scene, he compared Lawrence to a woman, called his men cattle, and delivered a line with a cruel smirk. A man cannot always be uniform, while pulling at Lawrence's torn clothes. But when the film was cut down even further for a 1971 re-release, all those lines were Remo. But in the shorter version, those seconds were gone. Lawrence went from being beaten to riding back into the desert, and the audience was left wondering why he suddenly seemed like a different person. That confusion carried into the rest of the film. The later violence, especially at Tafas, made no sense without seeing the psychological damage that had been done to him. Even O'Toole admitted in interviews that some of his best work had been cut. It took until 1989 for those lost moments to return, and even then, not everything could be restored. That same 1989 restoration also revealed something else that most people still don't know. The original Tafas massacre sequence was even darker than audiences realized. The new footage showed long shots of dead bodies and a moment where Lawrence calmly shoots a surrendering soldier. But what's still missing are scenes that Lean filmed in Morocco, where Lawrence orders his men to kill wounded Turkish soldiers with knives to save bullets. These weren't emotional acts of revenge driven by trauma and rage. They were cold, calculated executions, and they were actually filmed. Lawrence walked among the wounded enemy soldiers and gave the murder orders himself. But the footage was so disturbing that Lean never used it, fearing that audiences couldn't handle seeing the complete truth about who Lawrence had become. Lawrence's psychological breakdown went much deeper than what made it to any version of the screen. One of the most chilling lines ever written for the character was cut entirely from every version. After he executes a deserter named Qasim, Lawrence was supposed to say, with no emotion at all, "I enjoyed it." But that wasn't the end of the deleted dialogue. In another completely removed scene, Lawrence describes in horrifying detail the thrill he got from killing people, the sound of the gun firing, the way a man's face changes. Those scenes weren't small character moments. They showed real fear growing in the people who had once admired and followed him. And they explained why. Later in the film, the Arab coalition starts to fall apart. Without those scenes, the political collapse looks like just another case of cultural misunderstanding and tribal politics. But that wasn't the real reason. The reason was Lawrence himself and what he had become. And then there's a moral truth that the film never fully revealed to audiences. The real Lawrence of Arabia violated the accepted laws of war. Original footage that was filmed but never used captured him ordering the destruction of medical supplies and stopping Arab fighters from giving water to wounded Turkish soldiers. Under modern international law, these are considered war crimes. In private notes to Spiegel that were discovered decades later, David Lean openly questioned whether audiences could cheer for a man who, by today's standards, would be considered guilty of serious violations of international law. He was right to worry about audience reaction. If those scenes had been included in any version of the film, Lawrence would no longer be seen as a complicated, troubled hero. He would be something much, much darker. This brings us to the real villain of this story, Sam Spiegel himself. Spiegel didn't just trim a film to make it shorter. He took a knife to a masterpiece with the cold focus of a businessman chasing bigger profits. His logic was brutally simple and entirely about money. Every minute he cut from Lawrence of Arabia meant that theaters could squeeze in one more showing each day. That translated directly to more tickets sold, more revenue collected, and an extra $50,000 in profit for every single minute that disappeared from the screen. When he slashed 20 minutes from the film just weeks after its December 1962 Royal premiere, he made himself $1 million richer practically overnight. And just like that, David Lean's 222-minute epic became a 202-minute product designed for maximum profit. The art was completely secondary. The only goal was making money. Theater owners had complained that only 2 showings per day weren't enough to maximize their profits. Spiegel gave them 3 showings by cutting the movie shorter. But in doing so, he treated a towering work of cinema like a fast food item, cut for speed and customer turnover, rather than artistic integrity. For years, people believed that Lean had been away when the cutting happened, powerless to stop the destruction of his own work. That's the story Spiegel told everyone. That's what editor Anne V. Coates supported in interviews for decades. But later, she admitted that her memory had been completely wrong. Lean had been right there in the editing room the whole time, watching in helpless silence as his masterpiece was dismantled. Spiegel held all the financial power and legal control. Lean had nothing. The man who had spent years crafting a sweeping desert odyssey was forced to watch as someone else destroyed it, scene by scene, cut by cut. And then came the final cruelty. Spiegel told the world that it had all happened behind Lean's back, making the director look like a willing participant in the destruction of his own vision. But Spiegel didn't stop at just cutting the film. He made sure it could never be easily put back together. He deliberately scattered the removed footage across different storage locations, keeping it in pieces so that no one, not even Lean himself, could easily retrieve and restore it. This wasn't careless storage or poor organization. It was a calculated strategy to keep the original version buried forever. When restoration expert Robert A. Harris began hunting for the missing footage in 1986, he found himself following a cinematic treasure hunt through mislabeled film cans and forgotten storage vaults. What should have been kept in a single organized archive had become a deliberately fragmented mess, hidden on purpose across multiple locations. The famous goggles shot and many other key moments were presumed lost forever, simply because they had been hidden so well. For 25 years, from 1963 to 1988, the world watched a version of Lawrence of Arabia that was no longer complete, And the $600,000 restoration project was only necessary because Spiegel had made sure the original footage stayed buried and scattered. But the story gets even darker than deliberate hiding. There were quiet rumors in Hollywood that Spiegel may have committed insurance fraud. The lost footage wasn't really lost at all. It had been stored and hidden the entire time. Yet there were reports claiming it was gone, possibly triggering insurance payouts for missing and destroyed materials. If Spiegel filed insurance claims for lost footage while secretly possessing and hiding that same footage, that would constitute serious fraud. And apparently, no one in authority ever investigated these whispers. By the time the hidden reels finally re-emerged in the late 1980s, the statute of limitations for prosecuting such crimes had already passed. The potential crime, if it actually happened, was completely safe from any legal consequences. That's one of the dirtiest secrets hiding behind one of Hollywood's greatest and most celebrated films. Columbia Pictures didn't just allow this destruction to happen, they actively helped make it possible. Studio executives feared that Lean's artistic vision and slow pacing might hurt their bottom-line profits. They chose to side with Spiegel's business approach, rather than support their director's creative vision. Internally, Columbia executives knew exactly what was being done to damage the film. But publicly, they stood behind Spiegel's lies and cover-up. When David Lean took home his Academy Award for Best Director, he said nothing about what had been done to his movie. Columbia had made it crystal clear to him. Speak out publicly about this, and your career in Hollywood ends immediately. None of the cast members spoke up either. The silence from everyone involved wasn't agreement or approval. It was fear of career destruction. Columbia Pictures chose immediate profits over protecting an artistic legacy. They knew they were helping to destroy something irreplaceable, and they simply didn't care about anything except money. But sometimes, against all odds, justice does eventually win. In December 1986, a man named Robert A. Harris began what would become the most difficult film restoration project ever attempted in Hollywood history. For 2 months, he worked without any pay at all, searching through Columbia's disorganized storage vaults, combing through 6,000 pounds of scattered, mislabeled, rotting film materials. Then, in January 1987, something extraordinary happened. Hidden inside a small trim can that had been mislabeled and forgotten, Harris found the missing scenes. They had been there the entire time, just waiting to be discovered. He made a phone call in the middle of the night, almost crying with relief and excitement. He had found what everyone believed could never be found. But finding the footage was only the beginning of the real work. Much of what he discovered had no sound attached. Some pieces were badly decayed from years of poor storage. The fragments had to be carefully stitched back together, frame by frame, piece by piece. Some sections had been labeled as unused outtakes. Others had no labels at all. Harris had to reconstruct entire sequences like a jigsaw puzzle. And even after all that detective work, some scenes had to be completely redubbed. At the start of the film's second act, for instance, a 30-second segment required Peter O'Toole and Alec Guinness to return to recording studios and re-record lines they hadn't spoken in over 25 years. It was a desperate race against time and against further deterioration. David Lean, now 80 years old, returned to finish what had been stolen from him decades earlier. For 2 intense weeks in 1988, he worked alongside Harris to re-edit his entire masterpiece. This wasn't just technical restoration work. It was an elderly artist reclaiming something sacred that had been taken from him. Lean finally had the chance to present his life's work the way he had originally intended back in 1962. He personally approved every single frame, adjusted every sound, and even helped restore the original color timing and balance. The final result was a 216-minute version. Still not the complete original 222 minutes, but closer than the world had seen in over 2 decades. The technology used for this restoration didn't even exist when the film was first made in the early 1960s. Matching 26-year-old footage with new prints required digital techniques that were still cutting edge in the late 1980s. Some reels were missing sound entirely. Others had severely degraded visuals that had to be carefully repaired. Harris and his team had to rebuild entire scenes using whatever scraps and fragments they could locate, spending not just $600,000 on the restoration work itself, but another $2 million for new prints and worldwide promotion. The restored film featured spectacular 70mm prints with 6-track stereo sound, recreating the grandeur and power of the original roadshow screenings from 1962. Then, in 2012, Sony restored the film yet again for its 50th anniversary, using digital restoration tools that were far more powerful and precise than anything Harris had available in 1988. But it was Harris who deserves the credit for saving Lawrence of Arabia from being lost forever. One name that helped push this resurrection into the international spotlight was Steven Spielberg. As co-chair of the American Film Institute's Preservation Center, Spielberg stepped in as a powerful advocate for the restoration project. He had first seen Lawrence of Arabia in Phoenix as a teenager, and he always said it was the single film that made him want to become a director. Spielberg helped arrange special fundraising premieres in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles in February 1989. All proceeds from those screenings went directly to film preservation efforts. Spielberg's influence ensured that Columbia Pictures would fully cooperate with the restoration, and his personal endorsement gave the project the legitimacy and publicity it needed to succeed with both critics and audiences. The restored Lawrence of Arabia proved that sometimes, even when powerful people try to destroy art for profit, the art can survive and triumph. David Lean's complete vision, hidden for 27 years, finally returned to screens around the world. Audiences could see, for the first time since that royal premiere in 1962, what the director had actually created. The difference was remarkable. The restored scenes didn't just add running time, they completely changed how the story felt and what it meant. Lawrence's psychological journey from idealistic young officer to traumatized violent killer finally made complete sense. The political collapse of the Arab Revolt was no longer mysterious. It was the direct result of Lawrence's own moral destruction. Most importantly, the true ending that David Lean had crafted, the circular structure linking Lawrence's death to his desert transformation through the symbol of those broken goggles, was restored. The film once again began and ended as Lean had intended, creating a perfect haunting loop that showed how Lawrence's obsession with speed and danger had been present from the very beginning. This is why the lost ending changes everything about Lawrence of Arabia. It's not just that important scenes were missing, though they were. It's not just that the story made more sense with the cuts restored, though it did. The real revelation is what this story tells us about how art gets destroyed, and sometimes, miraculously, saved. For nearly 3 decades, people watched and loved a movie that wasn't complete. They gave it awards, wrote books about it, called it one of the greatest films ever made. And they were right to love it, even in its damaged form. But they were loving a shadow of what David Lean had actually created. The complete Lawrence of Arabia is a much darker, more disturbing, and ultimately more powerful film than the version most people know. It forces audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about heroism, about the psychological cost of violence, and about how trauma can transform someone into the very thing they once fought against. Sam Spiegel thought he was just trimming fat to boost profits. But what he actually did was remove the movie's moral center, its psychological foundation, and its artistic soul. He turned a complex meditation on violence and identity into a more conventional adventure story. He made it safer, more comfortable, and much less honest. The fact that the film survived it all, that Robert Harris found those hidden pieces, that David Lean lived long enough to approve their restoration, all of that feels like a miracle. How many other works of art have been destroyed by corporate greed and lost forever? How many masterpieces are sitting in storage somewhere, waiting for someone brave enough to fight for their resurrection? The story of Lawrence of Arabia's restoration should give us hope. It proves that art is stronger than the people who try to destroy it for profit. It shows us that sometimes, if we're lucky, if we're persistent, if we refuse to give up, we can bring back what was thought to be lost forever. But it should also make us angry. It should make us question how often this kind of artistic vandalism happens. How many films and books and songs and paintings get butchered by people who see them only as products to be optimized for maximum profit. David Lean spent his final years knowing that his masterpiece had been restored to something close to his original vision. He died in 1991, just 2 years after the restoration premiered. But those 2 years must have been incredibly satisfying for him. After nearly 30 years of silence, he finally got to see audiences react to his complete film. He got to read reviews of the movie he had actually made, not the chopped-up version that Sam Spiegel had created. The next time you watch Lawrence of Arabia, and if you haven't seen the restored version, you really should, remember that you're watching a film that almost didn't survive. You're seeing art that was buried, hidden, scattered, and presumed lost. You're experiencing the vision of a director who was forced to watch his masterpiece get destroyed and then spent decades waiting for justice. And remember that somewhere out there, in forgotten storage rooms and mislabeled cans and neglected archives, there are probably other masterpieces waiting to be discovered, restored, and returned to the world. The fight to save Lawrence of Arabia was won, but the larger battle to protect art from corporate destruction continues every single day. This has been the incredible true story of David Lean's Lost Ending, and how it changes everything about one of cinema's greatest masterpieces. If this story amazed you as much as it amazed me, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves great movies. And make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell, because there are so many more buried Hollywood secrets just waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, keep watching, keep questioning, and never stop fighting for the art that matters.